Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complex Cinema channel. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing and giving this video a thumbs up. Today, we are going to discuss the movie Dump the Past, Marry True Love. The story centers around a high-powered executive, Clara, whose life is meticulously ordered, much like the complex financial models she once crafted during her ascent in the cutthroat world of investment banking in New York. Her ambition, honed by years observing the transactional nature of Wall Street deals, has driven her success, but perhaps at the cost of genuine connection. She's a woman who believed that structure equated to happiness, until a sudden, almost cliché, professional fallout forces a drastic life change. Driven by a need to reconnect with something authentic, Clara impulsively decides to return to the quaint, slow-paced town she grew up in, a place she'd long dismissed as too small for her ambitions. This is where we meet Leo, the town's beloved, if slightly underappreciated, carpenter and restorer. Leo embodies the very antithesis of Clara's former life. His hands are skilled in tangible creation, his patience evident in the careful restoration of antique furniture, a craft he inherited from his own father, who taught him that true quality takes time. Leo's grounding presence is a stark contrast to the fleeting, paper-based triumphs Clara is used to chasing. Their initial interactions are predictably prickly. Clara, armed with her city sensibilities, sees the town as charmingly inefficient, while Leo finds her demanding, fast-paced energy grating. She tries to apply corporate efficiency solutions to community problems, viewing the local historical society's fundraising efforts, for instance, through the lens of a hostile takeover bid. Leo, whose community involvement is driven by genuine affection for the place, resists her calculated approach. However, the necessity of shared projects forces them into closer proximity. Perhaps they are both roped into organizing a local festival, or, more symbolically, repairing a landmark building that requires both Clara's organizational genius and Leo's practical skills. Through these collaborations, Clara begins to see the value in meaningful, unquantifiable work. She starts observing how Leo treats his craft, with respect for the material, a deep memory of its history, and a focus on longevity rather than quarterly returns. This echoes a moment from Clara's past, perhaps an early mentor who valued integrity over immediate profit, a lesson she'd buried under layers of executive performance reviews. For Leo, Clara is initially just a disruption, but he gradually perceives the vulnerability beneath her polished exterior. He notices the strain behind her perfect composure, realizing that her relentless drive stemmed from a deep-seated need for control, perhaps stemming from an early life instability she'd worked hard to transcend. As they spend time together, perhaps sharing quiet evenings where the only sounds are the crickets and the soft scrape of Leo's tools, their contrasting worlds begin to merge. He shares his philosophy. You can't rush the wood to dry, just as you can't rush genuine feeling. The inevitable conflict arises when Clara receives an enticing offer to return to her high-stakes career in the city, a siren call from the life she was supposed to want. This forces a confrontation where they must lay bare their deepest fears, Clara's fear of irrelevance without status, and Leo's fear that she will leave once the small-town novelty wears off. The climax is less about a dramatic chase and more about a quiet, deliberate choice. Clara realizes that the success she achieved felt hollow because it was built on external validation, whereas the small moments of connection with Leo, a shared laugh over a badly carved birdhouse, a moment of silent understanding while watching a sunset over the town square, provided a richer form of fulfillment. In the end, Clara chooses to trade her corner office view for the workshop dust. It's not a total abandonment of her skills, but a reapplication. She decides to use her formidable business acumen to help local artisans, like Leo, scale their craft responsibly, ensuring that authenticity is preserved while growth is achieved ethically. The final image is often one of partnership, not just romantic, but professional and personal, where the precision of the spreadsheet finally complements the integrity of the handcrafted joint. She's finally learned that true value isn't marked by a stock ticker, but by the lasting quality of what you build. Clara's New York existence had been a symphony of sharp angles and pressurized silence, the kind only found on the 40th floor, overlooking the relentless grid of Manhattan. Her brilliance in finance wasn't just about crunching numbers. It was about seeing patterns others missed, anticipating market shifts with an almost uncanny foresight, a trait she'd sharpened during her intense years at a major investment firm where bonuses were measured in seven figures and sleep was a negotiable luxury. Yet that very success became the gilded cage trapping her. When the inevitable shakeup arrived, perhaps orchestrated by a younger, hungrier protégé, the resulting exile felt less like a failure and more like a sudden, jarring silence after years of constant, high-pitched noise. She fled to her childhood haven, a place she'd long viewed with the condescension of someone who'd seen the world's largest economies in operation. The air here, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, was almost offensive in its lack of urgency. Leo, meanwhile, was the living embodiment of that slowness. A third-generation carpenter, his hands possessed an almost archaic knowledge of wood grain and joinery. He didn't just fix things, he seemed to commune with the material, coaxing forgotten beauty back into scarred oak dressers and warped porch swings. His inspiration wasn't a Bloomberg terminal. It was the enduring legacy of his grandfather's steady hand and the quiet pride of a perfectly fitted mortise and tenon. Their initial collisions were spectacular, if low volume. Clara, attempting to streamline the annual town fair's budget, treated the volunteer committee like a dysfunctional board of directors, armed with Gantt charts and aggressive synergy goals. Leo, whose commitment to the local historical society stemmed from the simple, unglamorous memory of his mother tending the town gardens, found her approach offensively transactional. He once caught her trying to optimize the wood storage shed, suggesting they liquidate the older, less immediately useful lumber stock, a suggestion that made him physically recoil, viewing it as an act of cultural vandalism. The turning point, subtle as the slow drying of varnish, began when they were tasked with restoring the old bandstand, a structure beloved but structurally unsound. Clara brought her project management skills, but this time they were aimed at something tangible, something that wouldn't vanish with the next fiscal quarter. She watched Leo work beneath the summer sun, his focus absolute, the sweat beading on his brow, a testament to honest labor. She recalled the mentor from her early banking days, a man named Marcus, who'd always preached about building legacy assets, not just quick wins, a lesson she'd willfully forgotten in her race to the top. This connection to something enduring, something that wouldn't be erased by a hostile takeover, began to resonate in the quiet chambers of her heart that she thought had atrophied long ago. Leo, observing Clara wrestling with a stubborn, rusted bolt, saw past the tailored blazer. He saw the slight tremor in her hand when she realized the problem required brute force rather than elegant calculation. He realized her control wasn't a sign of strength, but a meticulously maintained shield against the chaos she'd likely witnessed early on, maybe even in her own family, forcing her to believe only in what she could personally command. In the evenings, over simple shared meals where the only agenda was appetite, he'd speak about the patience of the wood, how forcing it would only lead to cracks. It was an unintentional metaphor for the human heart, one Clara absorbed deeply. The city's call, when it arrived in the form of a substantial offer to head a new global mergers division, was intoxicating. It represented validation, the ultimate return to the known quantity of power. This impending departure forced the necessary confrontation. Clara confessed her terror that without the prestige, she was just an empty suit, while Leo admitted his fear that she would always view his life here as a charming, temporary distraction, a quaint footnote before her return to the main text. The decision wasn't made in a dramatic, rain-soaked argument. It was made in the quiet afternoon light, filtering through the newly restored bandstand windows. Clara understood that the thrill of closing a billion-dollar deal was fleeting, a sugar rush compared to the deep, sustained warmth of building something real with someone who saw her whole self. She turned down the offer. Her new vision wasn't a retreat from capability, but a powerful redirection. She started applying her mastery of complex systems, logistics, market analysis, negotiation, to the very community she once disdained, crafting sustainable business models for Leo's carpentry collective and other local craftspeople, ensuring their artistry could thrive without compromising its soul. The final scene often settles on them standing amidst sawdust and blueprints, Clara sketching out expansion projections on a large sheet of drafting paper while Leo carefully sands the edge of a new table, the precision of her strategy finally married to the integrity of his craftsmanship, proving that value, true lasting value, is measured not by the speed of acquisition, but the depth of connection embedded within the creation. Clara's relocation felt less like a sabbatical and more like a forced detoxification from the adrenaline-laced environment she inhabited. Her apartment in New York had been minimalist, designed to minimize distraction, all glass, steel, and impersonal modern art. Here, the farmhouse she rented was cluttered with the ghosts of previous occupants, dusty relics that initially triggered her need to organize and purge, but eventually softened her edges. She missed the efficiency of digital data streams, but she started noticing the complex, analog data present everywhere. The specific way the afternoon sun warmed the south-facing wall of Leo's workshop, or the minute differences in patina on antique hardware that Leo could identify by touch alone. This deep sensory awareness was a kind of intelligence she had previously dismissed as sentimental noise. Leo's world was one of deliberate slowness, which Clara initially mistook for complacency. He was ruggedly built, not in the gym-sculpted way of her former finance colleagues, but with the dense, functional strength of someone who spends his life moving heavy, honest things. His eyes, often squinted against the glare of shavings, held a quiet amusement that suggested he found the entire human concept of urgency highly amusing. He had inherited not just the carpentry business, but a deep-seated philosophy from his father. Repair honors the past better than replacement dishonors the future. He wasn't immune to ambition, but his was focused on the perfection of a single dovetail joint, a goal that satisfied him completely. Their early clashes were fundamentally ontological. When Clara proposed using modern, prefabricated structural beams for the bandstand restoration, to save time, Leo had reacted with a quiet intensity that was more unnerving than any shouting match. He explained patiently that the soul of the structure lay in its relationship to the original materials, a concept that had no column on a balance sheet. This led Clara to a difficult self-reckoning. She had spent years building systems to control outcomes, yet here, Leo seemed to control nothing but his own integrity, and somehow his life felt more stable than hers ever had. She remembered Marcus, her banking mentor, talking about building a legacy, and realized she had misinterpreted him. Marcus meant enduring contribution, not enduring stock price. The slow thaw was catalyzed by shared physical effort. After a particularly grueling day, wrestling with water-damaged flooring in the bandstand, they sat on the steps, exhausted. Clara's hands, usually pristine, save for the occasional paper cut, were blistered and filthy. Leo handed her a thermos of strong black coffee, brewed in a way that honored the beans' slow roast. In that shared exhaustion, the defenses dropped. Clara confessed, hesitantly, that her relentless pursuit of wealth was partly fueled by a need to prove she wasn't dependent on anyone, a reaction to a childhood marked by financial instability she'd tried desperately to erase through monetary dominance. Leo simply nodded, accepting the information as another piece of necessary structure to understand the whole person, much like assessing the load-bearing capacity of an old beam. When the city beckoned again, it wasn't through a polite email, but a dramatic personal visit from a headhunter, dangling the keys to a kingdom Clara once ruled. The temptation was powerful, the immediate recognition, the familiar high-stakes choreography. For days, Clara was split, the sharp clarity of her analytical mind fighting the muddy, emerging contentment she felt watching Leo meticulously apply beeswax finish to a newly carved railing. She wrestled with the fear of being perceived as having failed down, of trading genius for quaintness. The ultimate realization arrived not in a grand romantic gesture, but while she was reviewing Leo's outdated, handwritten inventory ledgers. She saw how inefficient his brilliance was. He was leaving massive amounts of potential revenue on the table because he refused to compromise on quality or scale ethically. Her choice crystallized. She didn't want to be the CEO of a sterile global entity. She wanted to be the architect of meaningful, localized growth. She wanted to infuse the integrity Leo lived by into the scale she understood. Rejecting the city offer felt like closing a very loud, very expensive door, allowing her to finally hear the satisfying quiet click of the lock falling into place on her own terms. Her future involved leveraging her mastery of complex scaling to ensure that the beautiful, handcrafted things from this small town didn't just survive, but flourished authentically, built upon a foundation as solid as the finest mortise and tenon. The transition was not seamless. It was a deliberate, sometimes painful, recalibration of Clara's entire operating system. She traded high-yield bonds for supply chain logistics concerning sustainably sourced hardwoods, and quarterly earnings reports for the careful negotiation of fair pricing with local sawmills who viewed outsiders with inherent suspicion. Her initial attempts to digitize Leo's workshop inventory were met with the same guarded resistance she'd faced when first trying to streamline the town fair budget. Leo, while supportive of her presence, often watched her digital fervor with a knowing, slightly skeptical gaze, suggesting that some things, like the weight of a perfectly seasoned plank of cherry wood, could only be truly appreciated by handling them, not by inputting them into a database. Clara learned to slow down her pace of communication, adopting Leo's rhythm of thoughtful response rather than rapid-fire corporate jargon. She found herself spending afternoons on the dusty floor of the workshop, not managing, but learning the practical language of wood. She discovered the subtle difference between walnut and maple, realizing that each possessed its own inherent structural temperament, much like people. She began seeing the community not as inefficient human capital, but as a network of specialized artisans, each a vital piece of the local economy's infrastructure. Her initial motivation, to impose order, morphed into a genuine desire to amplify existing strengths. She started framing the business pitches not as selling wood, but as investing in lasting provenance, using her sharp understanding of market narratives to tell the compelling, authentic stories behind Leo's pieces. This new professional partnership naturally deepened their personal bond. Their arguments became less about methodology and more about the interpretation of details, whether a certain antique patina needed to be fully stripped or gently preserved. These debates were intimate, requiring a deep understanding of the other's core values. Leo, seeing Clara find genuine joy in the scent of linseed oil and the precise fit of a newly planned drawer slide, felt a profound sense of security. Her brilliance, once directed toward abstract market manipulation, was now focused on ensuring his craft could endure for generations. He started trusting her implicitly, not just with spreadsheets, but with the legacy of his family's work, seeing that her structure served not to control, but to protect the inherent beauty of what he created. The external world occasionally tried to pull Clara back. A former colleague would invariably track her down, usually at the one coffee shop in town that dared to offer espresso, painting the small-town life as a temporary bout of romanticized burnout. These encounters served only to highlight how insulated and ultimately shallow her former life had become. When one such executive aggressively tried to lure her into consulting work for a massive commercial real estate deal, Clara handled the negotiation with a quiet authority she'd never possessed in New York. She didn't just refuse. She dismantled his proposal's long-term sustainability based on flawed demographic projections she'd absorbed while researching local growth patterns for the artisanal cooperative. She was applying her genius, but now the integrity of the outcome mattered more than the size of the transaction. The culmination of their merged worlds wasn't a wedding or a grand public declaration, but the successful launch of the Artisan Collective, a small, beautifully curated showroom Clara designed, a space where Leo's meticulously crafted furniture stood alongside the hand-thrown pottery and woven textiles of their neighbors. Clara managed the complex digital presence and export logistics, ensuring that the global demand for authenticity was met without flooding the local supply or compromising quality. Watching Leo stand in the showroom, not as a tired craftsman, but as a recognized master whose work was now accessible to a discerning international audience, Clara felt a quiet, profound sense of accomplishment. It was the feeling of having successfully engineered a complex system where every component, the wood, the worker, the client, was valued equally, a feeling infinitely richer than any fleeting market victory. She had finally learned that true accumulation wasn't about hoarding wealth, but about cultivating lasting value. The true measure of Clara's transformation lay not in the polished success of the Artisan Collective, but in the small, unconscious shifts in her daily habits. She no longer reached for her phone first thing in the morning. Instead, she found herself pausing at the window, observing the quality of the morning light, a purely aesthetic consideration that would have been categorized as wasted time back in Manhattan. Her wardrobe, once a uniform of severe, expensive tailoring designed to project unassailability, had softened into practical, high-quality fabrics that could withstand a bit of sawdust, suggesting a physical alignment with her new environment. Leo, in turn, was slowly allowing some of Clara's digital efficiency into his meticulously analog world, but only after rigorous vetting. He let her design a simplified, visually intuitive inventory app on the condition that the physical tagging and location mapping of every piece of lumber remained paramount. He trusted her analysis of shipping tariffs, recognizing that while she understood the global market, she was fundamentally rooted in the preservation of the local craft. He admired how she could transform dense regulatory jargon into actionable steps for the potters and weavers, essentially translating the language of bureaucracy into the dialect of creation. This symbiosis meant that Leo could spend more time focusing on the nuanced beauty of a difficult restoration project, like the intricate inlay of a Victorian music box, without the nagging pressure of administrative overwhelm. Their evenings often involved sitting on the porch that Leo had painstakingly rebuilt, analyzing the day's minor victories. Clara would recount a successful negotiation with a boutique gallery owner in Los Angeles who appreciated the ethical sourcing story, while Leo would muse on the surprising strength he found in a piece of reclaimed barnwood. These conversations were dialogues between two distinct expertise fields, meeting at a shared point of integrity. There was a beautiful acknowledgement in their silence. Clara understood that Leo's patience was his greatest asset, and Leo understood that Clara's speed, when correctly channeled, was her own form of mastery. The final confirmation of her choice came unexpectedly during a visit to the city for a rare trade show. She walked through the towering lobbies of her former firm, noting the strained, hungry expressions on the faces of the young analysts, faces startlingly similar to her own former one. The air felt thin and aggressively competitive. She met with an old rival who, despite having achieved the highest executive position, seemed haunted by a constant need to prove his worth by dismantling something new. When the rival smugly suggested Clara was hiding from real challenge, Clara simply smiled, a genuine, unforced expression that felt alien to the marble halls. "The greatest challenge," she replied, her voice calm but resonant, "is not accumulating power, but managing authentic growth without sacrificing the foundation. That requires more complex mathematics than any leveraged buyout I ever structured." She saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes, the inability to quantify her statement, and knew she was utterly free. Returning home, she found Leo waiting for her, not with flowers, but with a freshly oiled tool handle customized perfectly for her grip, a subtle acknowledgement of her growing involvement in the workshop itself. It was a physical manifestation of their union, her organizational sharpness providing the secure handle, his craftsmanship ensuring the tool could last a lifetime of honest work. They were building something far more resilient than any corporate empire, a life where every contribution, large or small, was tethered to tangible value and enduring connection. The concept of enduring connection began to permeate every aspect of their shared life, moving beyond the business and into the subtle fabric of domesticity. Clara, who once subsisted on quick, nutrient-dense shakes to maximize work hours, found herself cultivating a small vegetable garden, a practice she approached with the same meticulous attention she once gave to risk assessment, but with an entirely different emotional payoff. She learned that the soil needed tending, not just demanding. It responded to care, not just control. Leo, observing her diligent weeding, remarked that she finally understood the rhythm of true investment, that the return wasn't instantaneous, but accrued over seasons of patient tending. Their conversations evolved beyond wood and finance into shared vulnerability about the landscapes of their pasts. Clara spoke more openly about the pressure cooker environment of her youth, the feeling of being perpetually on the edge of financial freefall, which explained her initial compulsion to overachieve and over-control. Leo reciprocated by sharing the quiet burden of stewardship, the weight of being the anchor for the entire legacy of his family's skilled trade in a world accelerating away from craftsmanship. He confessed his fear that his adherence to tradition made him obsolete. Clara countered that her restructuring ensured his tradition could finally speak the language of the modern marketplace without shouting. The artisan collective, now entering its second year, began attracting attention not just for the quality of its goods, but for its unique business model, a template for ethical small business scaling. Major regional economic publications started running profiles drawn by the narrative of the high-powered executive who swapped Wall Street for reclaimed barnwood. Clara, fielding these interview requests, always directed the focus back to the artisans. She insisted that the story wasn't about her redemption, but about the inherent, undervalued worth of skilled manual labor when coupled with intelligent, respectful operational strategy. She used her formidable presentation skills to frame the narrative precisely. This was not regression. It was a calculated pivot toward higher yield, intrinsically valuable assets. One afternoon, while reviewing the manifest for a large international order destined for a museum curator who specialized in preserving artisanal techniques, Clara felt a moment of pure, crystalline satisfaction. The order required complex crating, a task that demanded Leo's structural insight and Clara's precise documentation of fragile contents. As they worked side by side in the workshop, the air alive with the scent of fresh varnish and old timber, Leo paused, holding up a custom-cut support brace. He looked at Clara, his gaze steady and filled with an emotion that needed no corporate jargon to interpret. "You used to build towers of paper and debt," he said softly, turning the brace over in his hands. "Now you're building foundations that people can actually lean on. This is solid, Clara. All of it." Clara smiled, realizing that the applause she once craved from boardroom tables was pale compared to the quiet affirmation found in the tangible reality of Leo's approval. She reached out, not to adjust his work, but to gently trace the clean, perfect line of the brace he held. The future was no longer about climbing higher, but about building deeper, ensuring that the structure they were creating, their life, their business, their partnership, possessed the same enduring, honest integrity as the finest piece of wood Leo had ever restored. The shift in Clara's perspective fundamentally altered her relationship with time. She stopped measuring it in billable hours or quarterly review cycles, and started perceiving it through the slow, deliberate arc of seasons and the life cycle of their projects. This new temporal awareness was embodied perfectly by the massive, ancient oak tree dominating the edge of their property. A slow giant Leo refused to trim aggressively, citing the decades it took to establish its deep root system. Clara used to see the tree as an obstacle to efficient landscaping. Now, she saw it as a monument to patience. Her mastery of complexity was repurposed into managing the delicate dance between artistry and commerce. She introduced a tiered pricing model for the collective that clearly delineated between restoration work, which demanded meticulous, unhurried time, and new, standardized creations built for more immediate sale. This required extensive, calm negotiation with the older artisans, some of whom viewed any attempt at standardization as a betrayal of their individual spirit. Clara found she had to listen much longer than she had to speak, often sitting in silent observation during their meetings, until she could distill the unspoken anxieties and offer solutions framed in terms of artistic preservation rather than profit maximization. A strategy that required genuine empathy, a skill honed not in finance seminars, but in those quiet evenings watching Leo work. Leo, meanwhile, was becoming subtly more ambitious, yet his ambition remained tethered to quality. He started researching historical furniture construction techniques from across the continent, driven not by the desire for external recognition, but by a yearning to bring a richer, more diverse repertoire back to their small-town workshop. Clara handled the digital archiving of these findings, creating accessible, beautifully indexed visual libraries that Leo could reference instantly, thus merging Leo's tactile wisdom with Clara's systemic organization. He found that his creative blockages dissolved more quickly when he knew the administrative scaffolding holding up his vision was managed by someone he trusted implicitly. The most telling emotional detail of their integrated life was revealed during a sudden, intense autumn storm. The old farmhouse, despite Leo's best efforts, suffered minor damage, a large limb crashing through the attic space. In the past, Clara would have immediately called multiple contractors, demanded immediate quotes, and managed the chaos with ruthless efficiency. This time she stood with Leo under the flickering emergency light, assessing the damage not with panic, but with a shared sense of challenge. They worked together, cleaning the debris, the physicality of the shared effort feeling strangely comforting rather than stressful. Leo didn't direct her. He simply worked alongside her, treating her strength as equal to his own. That night, huddled together waiting for the power to return, Clara confessed her fear that she might someday wake up bored with the quietude, that the thrill of building something real might eventually pale against the memory of the intoxicating risk inherent in the markets. Leo simply took her hand, his rough calluses a grounding contrast to her smooth skin. "Boredom requires you to stop looking closely," he murmured. "There is more complexity, more risk, and more sheer beauty in getting one piece of joinery absolutely right than there ever was in moving $1 billion from one digital vault to another. You just have to be willing to look." In that moment, looking at the silhouette of the old oak against the stormy sky, Clara understood. She hadn't abandoned her intelligence. She had merely redirected her prodigious capacity for high-stakes engineering toward a life that offered compounding, tangible returns. Returns measured in the strength of community ties, the integrity of handcrafted goods, and the quiet, unwavering presence of the man beside her. Her success was no longer about dominance, but about enduring, quiet contribution, perfectly mirrored in the solid, well-made world they were painstakingly crafting together. The true test of their resilience arrived not from external pressures, but from the internal challenge of reconciling their differing views on risk management, a topic they now approached through the lens of legacy rather than immediate profit. Clara, ever the strategist, recognized the need to diversify the collective's client base beyond the current niche of high-end preservationists and boutique galleries. She proposed a partnership with a national educational foundation interested in funding vocational apprenticeships, a move that would secure long-term stability for the younger generation of craftspeople. This required significant capital outlay for specialized training equipment and a degree of public-facing advocacy that made Leo deeply uneasy. Leo's hesitation was rooted in the memory of how quickly external funding sources, especially government or large foundation grants, often came with strings attached, subtle erosions of autonomy that eventually forced adaptation away from core principles. He felt that the slow, organic growth, though less swift, was the only path guaranteed to preserve the sanctity of the craft. He argued that chasing scale meant sacrificing the very detail they were selling. Clara respected this deeply ingrained skepticism, recognizing it as the protective instinct of a guardian, not the stubbornness of an Luddite. Their negotiations became a masterclass in collaboration. Clara didn't push a proposal. She modeled scenarios. She used her old financial software, now repurposed for inventory flow and artisan wage projections, to demonstrate precisely how the foundation's investment could be structured as a protected endowment, legally firewalling the operational budget from outside interference, while guaranteeing salaries for the apprenticeships. She showed him, in excruciating detail, the legal language that would safeguard their intellectual property and artistic standards. It was a rare sight, the queen of high finance leveraging her knowledge not to acquire, but to fortify. Leo, poring over the projected flowcharts, finally saw the integrity in her structure. He realized that Clara wasn't trying to dominate the process. She was building them a fortress out of contracts and data, designed specifically to withstand the inevitable pressures of the larger world. His acceptance was quiet, marked by him presenting her with a finely crafted wooden box designed to hold her most important legal documents. A beautiful, tangible piece of their joint future. The success of the apprenticeship program soon validated Clara's foresight. Young people drawn to the genuine physicality of creation flocked to the workshop. Clara found unexpected fulfillment in mentoring these apprentices on the business side: how to invoice correctly, how to negotiate shipping insurance for delicate sculptures, and how to present their work with quiet confidence. She saw the same spark in their eyes that she used to see in her own reflection in polished skyscrapers: potent, hungry ambition, now directed toward creation rather than acquisition. The final note of peace settled when Clara received an invitation to be a keynote speaker at a major economic forum, the same forum where she was once slated to receive a major award before her career imploded. This time, the invitation wasn't to discuss market trends, but to present the sustainable local ecosystem model developed by the collective. She accepted, but only on the condition that Leo would accompany her, not as a prop, but as a co-presenter. Standing on that huge stage, clad in a simple, well-made linen dress, Clara didn't talk about wealth accumulation. She talked about the hidden metrics of true economic health: craftsmanship, community buy-in, and the longevity of human skill. As Leo stood beside her, grounding the conversation with stories of the grain and the grain of the wood, Clara felt an overwhelming sense of having finally arrived, not at a destination defined by status, but within a purpose defined by contribution, a reality infinitely richer than anything money could ever purchase. The atmosphere at the economic forum was electric, a highly pressurized environment that Clara now navigated with a curious detachment, like an anthropologist observing a familiar but ultimately alien tribe. The room was filled with the sharp scents of expensive cologne and nervous ambition, a stark contrast to the comforting scent of beeswax and sawdust that now clung subtly to her clothes. When she took the stage, the initial applause was tinged with a polite, perhaps patronizing curiosity about the executive who had willingly stepped off the main track. Clara did not rely on nostalgia for her past career. She wielded it like a precise tool. She began her presentation by flashing a slide filled with complex derivatives modeling, a visual shorthand for the chaos she used to manage, before smoothly dissolving it into an image of Leo's hands, calloused and strong, demonstrating the technique for applying a traditional oil finish. For years, she stated, her voice clear and authoritative, free from the frantic edge of her former life, my metric for success was volatility. We sought out risk, managed it, and profited from its successful containment. But this model, she gestured to the image of the workshop, this is engineered for permanence. Leo's contribution was minimalist but impactful. When asked how he ensured the quality of his apprentices' work matched his own exacting standards, he didn't launch into a lengthy technical explanation. Instead, he walked to a small display table Clara had set up near the podium, picked up a simple, perfectly balanced wooden mallet, and handed it to the moderator. "Feel the weight," he instructed quietly. "It tells you everything. If it feels wrong, it is wrong. You can't outsource integrity." The quiet, tangible weight of the tool in the corporate room spoke volumes that no financial report ever could. The audience reaction was fascinating. The younger attendees, trapped in the very cycles Clara had escaped, leaned forward, recognizing the authenticity. The established leaders, the ones who still measured success solely by quarterly gains, seemed slightly unsettled by the very idea that value could exist outside a measurable acquisition target. Clara deftly anticipated their questions, utilizing her deep understanding of shareholder value to reframe artisanal preservation as long-term, non-depreciating cultural assets. Back home, the success of the forum translated into a flood of inquiries, mostly focused on replicating the collective's structural resilience. Clara handled the influx by implementing a rigorous vetting process. She refused to engage with any potential partners who prioritized speed over craft integrity. Her newfound selectivity acted as a filter, ensuring that the growth remained sustainable and true to the ethos Leo had instilled in her. She was now the guardian of their shared boundary, using her analytical prowess to keep the wolves of unsustainable scaling at bay. Their personal life settled into a deep, comfortable rhythm that felt like the most sophisticated structure Clara had ever helped design. There was the shared ritual of closing the workshop at dusk, the sound of the heavy wooden door latching, signaling the end of professional labor. There were the quiet evenings where Leo might read aloud from a century-old carpentry manual, and Clara would sketch out plans for expanding the collective's digital outreach, marrying the archaic wisdom with modern dissemination. One evening, as they were inspecting the joinery on a custom-built dining table destined for a demanding client, Clara ran her hand over the smooth, tight connection between the legs and the apron. It was flawless. She looked at Leo, realizing that the relentless pursuit that once defined her, the need to conquer markets, had been entirely satisfied by this singular, perfect joint. It was a closure, a completion. She had taken the chaos she once feared and built order around something beautiful, something real. The past, with its cold towers and sharp elbows, was finally, completely, a dump site she had no need to revisit. Their life was built on the solid, undeniable truth of perfectly fitted wood. The true resonance of their achievement was felt not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, everyday affirmation of their merged realities. Clara found herself developing an almost innate sensitivity to the quality of materials, a far cry from her former life where everything was transactional and easily substituted. When they acquired a piece of antique cabinetry that required months of painstaking veneer repair, Clara didn't delegate the sourcing of the replacement wood. She spent a week researching historical timber markets, ultimately locating a small, defunct mill upstate that yielded wood with the exact cellular structure needed to blend seamlessly. This dedication to forensic detail demonstrated a commitment that transcended business strategy. It was an act of profound, focused reverence. Leo, witnessing this level of commitment to material history, began to relax his rigid stance on total isolation. He started allowing Clara to participate in the initial structural assessments of major commissions, acknowledging that her ability to instantly model stress points using spatial reasoning, a skill honed by years of visualizing complex portfolio structures, was invaluable in diagnosing hidden weaknesses in old beams. He learned to trust her rapid evaluations, understanding that her speed was not haste, but a highly optimized processing capability applied to physical reality. He often joked that she could spot dry rot faster than he could find his measuring tape, a sign of true acceptance. Their shared project of nurturing the apprentices flourished. Clara established a mentorship program where she paired the young woodworkers with local elders, ensuring that the oral traditions of the craft, the nuanced feeling of grain under the chisel, the specific sound a properly planned board should make, were transferred directly. She structured the apprentice contracts to heavily favor long-term commitment over immediate yield, effectively insulating them from the industry pressure to churn out cheap, fast furniture. This was Clara fighting the good fight, using the very mechanisms of capitalism, contracts, incentives, and structured longevity to enforce artisanal purity. The final symbolic bridging of their worlds occurred when they decided to renovate their farmhouse's study, the space where Clara kept her few remaining symbols of her former life. A heavy minimalist desk and a framed, slightly yellowed copy of a major financial regulation she'd helped draft. Leo insisted on building her a new desk, one that perfectly suited her needs. He didn't create a piece of stark modernism. He fashioned a substantial, warm cherry wood desk, incorporating subtle, hidden compartments modeled after the efficient, segmented drawers of an old banker's filing cabinet. When he unveiled it, Clara touched the smooth, oiled surface. "It's perfect, Leo. It honors my past structure, but makes it warm." Leo leaned against the doorframe, watching her trace the lines of the grain. "It's built to last, Clara, like everything else worth keeping." In that moment, the narrative of the film concludes not with a grand, sweeping romantic gesture, but with the quiet satisfaction of true integration. Clara was no longer the high-powered executive in exile, nor was Leo just the local craftsman. They were co-architects of a life where strategic intelligence and tangible dedication were indistinguishable components of a single, successful creation. The past was dumped, not because it was bad, but because its valuable structures had been salvaged, refined, and built into a far more meaningful foundation. The cinematic offering, Dump the Past, Marry True Love, presents a somewhat familiar narrative framework, yet it endeavors to explore the nuanced complexities of emotional baggage and the arduous journey toward genuine connection. The film centers around the protagonist, whose life choices have evidently been shadowed by prior disappointments, creating a palpable resistance to embracing a potentially fulfilling future. This resistance isn't merely plot device. It feels rooted in a deeply ingrained sense of caution, a survival mechanism developed after significant emotional investment yielded painful results. Central to the film's success, or perhaps its occasional stumble, is the performance of the lead actor, whose previous work often showcased a remarkable ability to convey internal turmoil subtly. Drawing perhaps on the understated emotional depth seen in their earlier independent films, those gritty character studies that first garnered critical attention, this actor manages to imbue the character with a believable hesitancy. Their past, vaguely hinted at, as involving a high-stakes professional entanglement that also served as a failed romantic partnership, informs every guarded glance and every delayed affirmation of affection toward the new romantic interest. The love interest, conversely, often embodies a more transparent, perhaps even idealized, form of emotional availability. This character's background, frequently painted as being one rooted in stable, perhaps less dramatic, environments, maybe even involving a career in something concrete like architecture or established business consulting, as suggested by their assured demeanor, serves as a necessary foil. They represent the uncomplicated future the protagonist fears they do not deserve or are incapable of sustaining. The dynamic between these two suggests a deliberate contrast. The scarred veteran of emotional warfare facing off against the earnest newcomer, eager to prove that love isn't always a zero-sum game. One noticeable element is the film's visual language, which seems to deliberately shift as the relationship progresses. Early scenes, depicting the protagonist alone or navigating their past environment, are often bathed in cooler, more muted tones, reflecting a professional or personal landscape that feels emotionally sterile. As the connection deepens, the cinematography warms considerably, echoing the visual palette often favored by directors known for romantic comedies who prioritize lush, inviting settings, a clear cinematic cue signaling emotional thawing. This technique, while perhaps a touch conventional, effectively mirrors the internal shift happening within the guarded heart of the main character. The writing grapples with the concept of dumping the past. It's not simply about forgetting, it's about processing and recontextualizing past hurts so they cease dictating present actions. The film suggests that true love requires an active choice to believe in a new reality, even when old scars ache. The secondary characters, the wise best friend, or the well-meaning but overly cautious family member serve their purpose in pushing the protagonist toward this necessary leap of faith, often drawing upon their own, perhaps less dramatic, yet equally valid life lessons. Ultimately, the film's effectiveness hinges on whether the audience believes the transition from deep-seated cynicism to open vulnerability is earned. If the screenplay relies too heavily on grand gestures rather than sustained, quiet moments of mutual understanding, the emotional payoff might feel synthetic. However, the inherent charisma of the lead performers, coupled with a narrative that seems inspired by the popular contemporary desire to heal visible wounds before moving forward, ensures that Dump the Past, Marry True Love resonates with viewers familiar with the arduous, yet ultimately rewarding, work of choosing love over self-protection. It's a story about dismantling one's own carefully constructed fortress, brick by emotional brick. The protagonist's career trajectory, which one gathers involved significant public scrutiny, perhaps in fields such as investigative journalism or even high-profile corporate law, judging by the character's sharp intellect and innate defensiveness, explains much of their inability to lower their guard. When one's professional life demands constant vigilance against being exploited, that habit tends to bleed directly into the personal sphere. The initial attraction to the love interest might stem from a subconscious craving for the stability they project, a life unburdened by the shadows the protagonist constantly carries. This new person, let's imagine them as a dedicated artisan, or perhaps someone deeply involved in community welfare work, represents a grounded existence that feels utterly alien, yet profoundly magnetic. The emotional texture of the film deepens in the second act when the inevitable confrontation with the past occurs. It's not just a simple reveal of a betrayal. It's the reliving of the foundational insecurity that fuels the protagonist's current paralysis. We see the actor deploy those subtle facial twitches they perfected in that early minimalist drama where they played a conflicted academic, a slight tightening around the eyes that speaks volumes without a single line of dialogue. This history isn't just an event. It's a psychological architecture that must be dismantled. What makes the dynamic compelling is the patience exhibited by the love interest. They don't rush the healing. Instead, they seem to understand, almost instinctively, that true connection requires time, like a complicated scientific process, rather than a sudden spark. This patience suggests the love interest has perhaps navigated their own, less dramatic, but equally important, personal trials, maybe witnessing the dissolution of a long marriage within their family, instilling a deep respect for the fragility of commitment. This background prevents them from becoming a mere pedestal for the protagonist's growth. They possess their own quiet strength. The moments of genuine connection often occur not during planned dates, but during shared vulnerability in mundane settings, fixing a leaky faucet, or perhaps collaborating on a small, unexpected project. These unscripted interactions serve to blur the lines between the protagonist's guarded professional self and their yearning for intimacy. The camera lingers on these instances, using shallow focus to isolate the two characters against a busy background, visually asserting that in this shared space, the noise of the past has temporarily faded. The central tension remains whether the protagonist can accept that the past, while formative, is not the entirety of their potential future. The resolution, if handled well, won't be a magical erasure of pain, but rather an integration, acknowledging the scars as part of the map that led them to this specific, hard-won moment of choice. The film asks the audience to root not just for the romance, but for the protagonist's sheer, exhausting act of self-forgiveness, a far more difficult task than simply falling in love. The success of Dump the Past, Marry True Love rests heavily on convincing us that this deep, protective shell, built over years of survival, is genuinely worth the risk of cracking open. The internal conflict reaches its zenith when the protagonist is faced with an external success that mirrors the previous failure, effectively forcing a contemporary reenactment of their trauma. If the actor's prior career included a role where they had to convincingly project triumph masking deep internal dissonance, perhaps as a driven CEO in a short-lived television series, that experience informs this critical juncture. They almost sabotage the budding relationship, not out of malice toward the new partner, but out of a deeply ingrained belief that any pinnacle of happiness must inevitably be followed by a precipitous fall. This self-sabotage manifests as a retreat into professional rigidity, a temporary readoption of the armor that kept them safe previously. The characterization of the love interest deepens as we understand that their apparent emotional stability isn't naivete, but resilience forged in a different fire. Perhaps their inspiration comes from real-life figures known for unwavering dedication, someone who builds things that last, whether tangible structures or emotional bonds. Their reaction to the protagonist's retreat is crucial. Instead of anger or immediate abandonment, there is a quiet, steadfast presence. This character understands the difference between holding space for someone and trying to force them out of their own shadow. Their quiet determination suggests a philosophy inherited from a stable upbringing, one where problems are examined and repaired, not discarded. The film uses contrasting environments to underscore the emotional shift. The protagonist's apartment, initially depicted with severe, minimalist lines and an emphasis on functional, almost cold design, mirroring the aesthetic of serious, uncompromising modern architecture popular in film sets portraying high achievers, slowly begins to accommodate softer elements introduced by the love interest. A hand-knitted blanket, a slightly disorganized collection of meaningful objects. These small incursions of domestic warmth are as significant as any grand romantic gesture, signaling a slow, almost unconscious acceptance of shared vulnerability. The dialogue, particularly in the latter half, moves away from expository explanations of past wounds and toward shared visioning for the future. The moments that truly sell the romance are those where the characters discuss abstract concepts like legacy or fulfillment, allowing the protagonist to engage intellectually with the possibility of a positive future without the immediate, terrifying pressure of emotional intimacy. This intellectual pathway validates the character's intelligence while allowing the heart to catch up at its own pace. The subtle genius of the film lies in portraying love not as a sudden lightning strike, but as a carefully considered, albeit terrifying, long-term investment strategy that finally seems worth the risk. The final acceptance feels earned because the audience has witnessed the dismantling of a psychological barrier that was, for years, the protagonist's only true source of security. The resolution of the narrative arc hinges not on the absence of the past, but on the protagonist's successful integration of their learned caution into a framework of hopeful engagement. This final phase is visually represented by a shift in personal presentation. Where the lead once favored impeccably tailored, almost severe professional attire, a uniform signaling control and emotional distance, perhaps echoing the stringent dressing habits observed in actors who successfully transition from stage intensity to screen realism, we begin to see subtle allowances for comfort. A slightly softer fabric, a color that reflects the warmth introduced by the love interest's presence, suggests an internal yielding that is more authentic than any forced declaration of love. The love interest, whose inspiration one can now trace to those tireless philanthropists or educators who value persistence over immediate results, mirrors this integration by demonstrating that their unwavering nature is not rigidity, but flexible strength. They don't suddenly become dramatically insecure to meet the protagonist halfway. Rather, they articulate the boundaries they require to sustain the relationship, offering a new kind of security built on mutual respect for individual needs, rather than subsuming one identity into another. This maturity in the supporting role prevents the film from dissolving into a mere rescue fantasy, positioning it instead as a dual commitment to emotional self-work. The film's climax often avoids a public declaration, preferring an intimate moment of shared silence where the weight of past hurts is acknowledged but no longer allowed to dominate the present space. This quietude draws upon the acting tradition of portraying profound interiority, perhaps recalling the intense, nonverbal performances seen in European cinema that foreground emotional process over plot mechanics. In this silence, the protagonist finally drops the intellectualized defense mechanisms, the meticulously constructed arguments against vulnerability, and simply accepts the offering of genuine partnership. The lingering feeling the film leaves is that dumping the past is a misnomer. The past is carried, but its weight is redistributed. It becomes a reference point for gratitude toward the present security, rather than a chain dictating future action. The success of Dump the Past, Marry True Love ultimately resides in its refusal to offer an easy fix, instead valorizing the arduous, often unglamorous daily choice to trust another person with one's fully known imperfect self. This grounded, process-oriented approach to healing distinguishes it from lighter fare, lending the romance an enduring, hard-won authenticity. The lingering effect of the film is precisely that earned authenticity, which speaks to a deeper understanding of modern emotional labor. The protagonist's final embrace of commitment isn't a sudden epiphany. It's the culmination of measurable, painstaking behavioral changes. We see this evidenced in how they handle a minor crisis after the main emotional hurdles have been cleared, perhaps a delayed flight or a professional slight. Instead of the initial, reflexive shutdown or aggressive countermaneuver, there is a moment of measured communication, perhaps even a self-deprecating joke directed toward their own former intensity, suggesting an evolution toward self-awareness rather than mere reaction. This mirrors the growth seen in actors known for meticulously crafting characters who evolve incrementally, drawing on years of subtle observation rather than relying on grand, instantaneous shifts. The love interest's resilience, inspired by figures who built enduring institutions or movements through steady effort, is further illuminated by their willingness to establish gentle, necessary boundaries. They don't simply absorb the protagonist's lingering fear. They articulate what is needed for the relationship to remain healthy, thereby shifting the dynamic from one of rescuer and rescued to one of equal partners managing complex interior lives. This is communicated not through shouting matches, but through carefully chosen words spoken in the warmth of their shared domestic space. The space now visibly softened by the protagonist's concessions. The score, which likely utilized dissonant, minor keys during the early scenes of isolation, transitions seamlessly into melodic, major key arrangements that are restrained enough not to feel saccharine. This musical evolution acts as a subliminal reassurance to the audience that the emotional terrain is now safe for optimism. The inspiration for this subtle orchestration might be traced to composers known for building emotional resonance through texture and implication rather than overwhelming volume, lending the film a sophisticated layer of emotional scaffolding. Moreover, The film subtly addresses the performance of healing itself. The protagonist stops trying to appear healed for the sake of the relationship and begins the less visible, more difficult work of simply being present. The final scenes often eschew traditional romantic climax for scenes of shared ordinary life, perhaps planning a future trip or investing in a joint project, activities that demand consistent trust and forward-looking collaboration. This emphasizes that marrying true love isn't the end of the story. It is the beginning of the ongoing, mutually supported effort to keep the past in its appropriate, non-controlling place. The film thus succeeds by demonstrating that true intimacy is less about finding the perfect person and more about developing the necessary capacity to receive and sustain profound, earned affection. The sustained resonance of the narrative lies in its commitment to depicting emotional integration as a continuous negotiation, rather than a definitive victory over old demons. The protagonist, having navigated the treacherous landscape of self-doubt, begins to exhibit a quality often associated with actors who master deeply psychological roles, an acceptance of imperfection as inherent to authenticity. This acceptance manifests in moments where they willingly delegate control or admit ignorance, actions antithetical to the guarded professional persona established early on. Imagine the actor drawing upon the quiet confidence displayed in their less publicized theater work, where vulnerability was often displayed through nuanced physical stillness. To convey that true strength is knowing when to relinquish the facade of absolute command. The love interest's sustained commitment is revealed not as blind faith, but as a form of active, informed partnership. Their background, perhaps steeped in the organizational principles of long-term conservation or sustained scientific research, informs their belief in steady accumulation of trust. They do not require the protagonist to discard their history, only to reclassify it as data rather than destiny. This dynamic avoids the trap of portraying the protagonist as fixed by the relationship. Instead, the love interest acts as a necessary, stable mirror reflecting a future self the protagonist had deemed impossible. The visual language reinforces this. The spaces they now share feel less curated, more lived in, a tangible representation of two complex systems successfully merging without mutual annihilation. A particularly poignant element is the handling of relapse, the inevitable moment when an old trigger causes the protagonist to momentarily revert to defensive behavior. In a lesser film, this would necessitate a major confrontation. Here, the reaction is muted, a fleeting shadow passing over the protagonist's face, immediately noticed, but gently handled by the partner. This subtlety suggests an evolution in both characters, the protagonist's quicker self-correction and the partner's practiced empathy, avoiding the reaction of fear or withdrawal. It's a testament to the writing that these small regressions feel more real than any grand reconciliation scene. The film suggests that the true love mentioned in the title is synonymous with the security of being fully seen, flaws and all, without punitive judgment. The external world which once demanded perfection is now viewed through the lens of this secure internal partnership. Even professional successes are now shared as experiences rather than isolated trophies. This final perspective shift elevates dump the past, marry true love beyond standard romantic fare. It becomes a commentary on how genuine connection fundamentally alters one's capacity for resilience against the world's inherent harshness, validating the slow, often unseen labor of internal emotional restructuring. The ultimate success of this portrayal hinges on the film's nuanced exploration of legacy, both personal and relational. The protagonist's initial drive, fueled by the need to outrun or compensate for past emotional failures, stemmed from a desire to craft an impenetrable narrative of success. Now, however, inspired by the enduring, often less celebrated achievements of their partner, perhaps someone whose work involves meticulous preservation of historical artifacts or long-term ecological restoration, the focus shifts from building walls to cultivating fertile ground. This change is visually reinforced in the closing montage, which avoids sweeping vistas of romantic achievement and instead concentrates on small, shared rituals of maintenance, tending a garden, organizing shared digital archives, or simply reading side by side in comfortable silence. The actor portraying the protagonist demonstrates this final acceptance through an almost radical stillness. Where there was once nervous energy or hyper-vigilance conveyed through sharp movements, there is now a grounded presence. This echoes the performance style of certain veteran actors who, after years of intense, physically demanding roles, find their most profound impact in moments of minimal gesture, allowing the accumulated weight of their character's journey to speak for itself. Their past intensity is transmuted into focused presence. The love interest, often characterized by a quiet idealism rooted in practical effort, provides the necessary ballast. Their inspiration might come from the historical figures who championed slow, systemic change over immediate revolution. Individuals who understood that real transformation takes generations. This perspective prevents them from demanding the protagonist suddenly become an entirely new person. Instead, they cherish the integration process, respecting the protagonist's inherent complexities. Their patience is not passive waiting. It is an active, conscious choice to trust the unfolding process of emotional repair. The film subtly suggests that the greatest act of rebellion against a painful past is the deliberate construction of a peaceful future. The final, unspoken agreement between the two is that vulnerability is not a temporary weakness to be overcome, but a sustainable mode of being within a trusted partnership. Dump the past. Marry true love ultimately functions as an understated meditation on emotional maturity. The past isn't discarded, it is methodically unpacked, its contents examined without prejudice, and finally, relegated to the archives of experience, allowing the present relationship to flourish unburdened by its former authority. This refusal to offer a simplistic, instantaneous cure is what grants the narrative its lasting, resonant power. The lasting impact of the film resides in its sophisticated refusal to equate healing with erasure. The protagonist doesn't magically shed their former self. Rather, they achieve a state of emotional alchemy where past trauma is transformed from a debilitating weight into a source of deeper empathy. This is reflected in their interaction with external pressures, where previously a professional slight would trigger an overblown, self-protective reaction, a trait often seen in actors who transition from intense dramatic roles requiring high emotional volatility. Now, the protagonist responds with calibrated detachment, suggesting an internal landscape that is finally regulated. This newfound equilibrium is a direct consequence of the relational security provided by the partner. The love interest's character arc, inspired perhaps by the persistent efforts of master craftspeople who dedicate decades to perfecting a singular skill, solidifies their role as a co-architect of stability. Their strength is not characterized by an absence of problems, but by their consistent method of addressing them. This consistency allows the protagonist to test the safety of the new relationship framework repeatedly. For instance, when the protagonist inadvertently resurrects a boundary from a past failed relationship, the partner does not react with offense, but with gentle inquiry, prompting the protagonist to actively identify the outdated trigger rather than simply reacting to the perceived threat. This dialogue of mutual understanding becomes the film's most vital mechanism for closure. The visual storytelling mirrors this internal stabilization by showcasing environments that are neither the cold, imposing structures of the protagonist's defense mechanisms nor the overly sentimentalized settings of idealized romance. Instead, we see spaces characterized by balance, natural light, functional beauty, and evidence of shared effort. These settings suggest a mature aesthetic where complexity is welcomed, a departure from the binary thinking that previously afflicted the lead. This visual evolution mirrors the career trajectory of directors who move past early stylistic bombast toward deeper narrative economy, proving that restraint can hold more emotional power than excess. Ultimately, Dump the Past, Marry True Love functions as an endorsement of relational work. The true climax isn't the romantic reunion, but the moment the protagonist chooses to invest significant energy into nurturing something new, fully aware of the potential cost, yet recognizing the greater cost of continued emotional isolation. The film leaves the audience with the quiet conviction that true love is not the absence of baggage, but the mutual agreement to carry it responsibly, side by side, toward a shared and intentionally built horizon. The film's final testament to integration is subtly woven into the mundane details of shared future planning. The protagonist, formerly obsessed with control and the meticulous management of perception, a characteristic perhaps refined during early career moves in high-stakes corporate negotiation or political advising, now engages in shared calendaring and vacation planning with genuine, unforced enthusiasm. This willingness to commit time and resources to an unknown future signifies a profound psychological safety net that supersedes the old need for immediate, verifiable results. The actor conveys this through softening their gaze during these planning moments, allowing the eyes, which previously held a sharp, assessing quality, to soften into genuine anticipation, reflecting a technique often employed by seasoned performers to signal deep emotional vulnerability without resorting to overt melodrama. The love interest's influence, which draws inspiration from mentors in fields valuing long-term ecological health, where immediate gains are sacrificed for enduring vitality, is shown in their reaction to the protagonist's moments of lingering professional pride. When the protagonist achieves a significant public success, the partner's reaction is not one of competitive jealousy or overshadowing affirmation, but quiet, focused pride in the person, not the achievement. This is crucial. It confirms that the protagonist is valued for their authentic self, not the successful mask they wear. This contrasts sharply with the implied history where professional triumphs were inherently entangled with and ultimately destructive to personal relationships. The narrative's visual palette reaches its final, settled harmony. The color grading moves away from the high-contrast tension of the early acts and the saturated warmth of the midpoint reconciliation, settling into a balanced, natural light that suggests authenticity over artificial atmosphere. The interiors are now characterized by objects that possess history and patina, rather than sharp newness, a visual cue signifying that the relationship embraces imperfection and the beauty of the aged and enduring. This careful attention to environmental detail reflects the directorial inspiration, likely drawing from filmmakers renowned for using set design as a psychological extension of the characters, making the setting itself an active participant in the healing process. Ultimately, the film successfully argues that dumping the past is a myth. Instead, we learn to honor its lessons without capitulating to its fears. The final scene often eschews the typical grand romantic embrace for a shared moment of quiet work or reflection, perhaps gazing out at a horizon the protagonist previously refused to acknowledge. This ending resonates because it validates the difficulty of internal change. It confirms that marrying true love is less about finding a perfect mate and more about achieving the internal capacity to sustain a complex, messy, yet deeply rewarding, honest connection, built brick by patient brick upon the foundation of acknowledged, integrated history. The true triumph of Dump the Past, Marry True Love lies in its depiction of relational equity, a concept hard-won by the protagonist after years of operating under a deficit mentality. The dynamic, having moved beyond the initial savior-saved structure, now rests on the protagonist's demonstrated capacity for reciprocal support. This is most evident when the love interest faces their own professional or personal setback, a moment that, in the protagonist's past, would have been seized as an opportunity to retreat or impose control. Instead, the protagonist steps forward, utilizing the very emotional toolkit they spent the film acquiring. This reciprocity confirms that the healing wasn't solely for their own benefit, but fundamentally shifted their ability to function as a stable partner. This echoes the career evolution of actors who master supporting roles after years in the spotlight, demonstrating that true star power can manifest in supportive, nuanced contributions rather than sole dominance of the frame. The internalized voice of caution, once the protagonist's constant companion, doesn't vanish, but rather transforms into a quiet voice of discernment. This shift is perceptible in how the protagonist evaluates new information or social interactions. They still notice potential threats or inconsistencies, drawing perhaps on the analytical rigor demanded by their former high-pressure career, but they now filter this data through the context of their current secure relationship. The fear response is slowed, allowing logic and trust to intervene before panic sets in. This nuanced depiction respects the psychological reality that deep-seated coping mechanisms are habits of survival, not easily eradicated ideologies. The character inspiration behind the love interest often suggests a background in long-term stewardship, perhaps an agriculturalist or someone dedicated to preserving endangered arts, whose patience stems from understanding that growth requires seasons and dormancy. They understand that commitment is an ongoing verb, not a static noun. This informs their gentle but firm insistence on maintaining the relational practices they established during the healing phase, ensuring that the protagonist doesn't slide back into old isolation patterns under the guise of self-sufficiency. Their quiet influence ensures the relationship remains a shared project, not merely a safe harbor for the protagonist. The film's enduring message, conveyed through these mature interactions, is that vulnerability, once seen as the ultimate risk, is eventually understood as the only pathway to genuine fulfillment. The cinematography continues to favor natural, unforced compositions, reinforcing the idea that life, when lived honestly within a trusted bond, possesses its own inherent beauty, distinct from the manufactured perfection once sought. Dump the Past, Marry True Love concludes not with a perfect ending, but with the recognition of a perfectly viable, ongoing commitment to mutual emotional maintenance, a far more profound and relatable achievement. The final layer of complexity the film explores is the protagonist's recalibration of ambition in light of their newfound emotional equilibrium. Their prior, consuming drive, which we inferred was geared toward external validation, the need to silence past critics or anxieties through demonstrable success, now appears tempered. This evolution suggests the protagonist has finally parsed the difference between healthy aspiration and defensive overachievement. We observe this when they accept a professional opportunity that offers less prestige but more intrinsic alignment with their values, a choice unthinkable in the film's opening act. The actor, perhaps drawing on their own growth trajectory from intensely focused, career-driven roles to more nuanced, character-driven narratives, embodies this shift not with regret over lost glory, but with quiet satisfaction in purposeful redirection. The armor of relentless ambition is finally set aside. The love interest acts as the stable reference point for this change, their own foundational values proving unshakable. Their inspiration, rooted in the long view of historical continuity or intergenerational wisdom, provides the narrative anchor. They are not merely accepting the protagonist, they are actively fostering an environment where the protagonist feels permission to be less than perfect without fear of relational cost. This is illustrated in scenes where they encourage the protagonist to share intellectual pursuits or hobbies that hold no professional currency, validating the value of unmonetized joy, a stark contrast to the protagonist's earlier life where every endeavor was rigorously justified by outcome. The soundtrack reinforces this sense of earned peace. The musical language, having shed the agitated tension and the saccharine swells of early romance, settles into a resonant, understated score, dominated by acoustic instruments and minor modulations that resolve cleanly into major chords. This sonic texture suggests that conflict is acknowledged, but resolution is natural and expected, not forced. It's the sound of sustained domesticity, built on deep understanding, echoing the work of composers known for scoring films where internal drama supersedes external action. In its conclusion, the film offers a profound statement on the nature of commitment. That true love demands the conscious, continuous divestment from self-protection mechanisms constructed during times of pain. The past is not eliminated. It is integrated as a cautionary tale, one that informs better choices in the present. Dump the past. Marry true love achieves its resonance by focusing intently on the labor of internal reorganization, positioning the successful romantic outcome not as a final destination, but as the necessary condition for continuing the difficult, rewarding work of being fully, authentically present. The true, quiet profundity of the film's resolution lies in the protagonists finally cultivating an internal landscape that mirrors the stability of their external partnership. The external world, which once felt like an arena requiring constant strategic maneuvering, now seems manageable because the internal self is no longer fighting a civil war. This is demonstrated through their relationship with silence. Early in the film, silence was fraught, a space for anxiety to breed or for the protagonist to prepare their next defense. Now, shared silence with the love interest is restorative, a sign of deep, unquestioned connection. The actor conveys this in the final sequences with minimal dialogue, holding a gaze that communicates, "I see you, I am safe, and the performance is over." This echoes the late career mastery of performers who communicate entire psychologies through subtle shifts in breathing or posture, moving beyond the necessity of declarative dialogue. The love interest's steadfastness is further illuminated by their ability to foster genuine intellectual sparring without triggering the protagonist's defensiveness. Drawing inspiration from pedagogical philosophies that champion inquiry over dogma, they challenge the protagonist's assumptions not to win an argument, but to collaboratively refine reality. When the protagonist expresses a lingering, cynical prediction about a future event, the partner engages by asking probing, Socratic questions rather than offering platitudes. This dynamic respects the protagonist's formidable intellect, the very quality that made them successful yet guarded, by utilizing it constructively rather than trying to suppress it entirely. Visually, the film hints at the protagonist shedding their final vestiges of professional rigidity by embracing the imperfections of their physical surroundings. If their earlier home was defined by sharp right angles and unblemished surfaces, the shared space now features handcrafted items that bear the visible mark of their making. A slightly uneven pottery glaze, a patch in a favorite armchair. These imperfections are consciously celebrated, suggesting the protagonist has internalized the lesson that things worth keeping often carry the evidence of wear and repair. This visual metaphor confirms that the relationship is valued because of its lived-in reality, not in spite of it. Ultimately, the film reframes the concept of marrying true love. It's revealed to be less about finding a perfectly harmonious match and more about finding the one person whose presence allows you to finally drop the weapons you never knew you were still carrying. The victory isn't the absence of the past, but the conscious, daily decision to leave the past's jurisdiction. Dump the past. Marry true love succeeds because its resolution is active, not passive. It is the sustained choice to engage in the terrifying, yet ultimately liberating act of sustained, imperfect togetherness. The very final note the film strikes is one of integration into the broader community, a subtle but powerful indicator of the protagonist's true psychological recovery. Having spent so much energy curating and isolating their world to manage past anxieties, the idea of genuine, non-transactional community engagement was once an impossibility. Now, we see moments where the couple participates in shared civic life, perhaps volunteering for a cause the love interest champions, or simply hosting a small, low-stakes gathering for friends. These scenes are deliberately devoid of high drama. The success is measured by the protagonist's ability to show up as their authentic, slightly awkward, but finally honest self, without needing to dominate the conversation or engineer the outcome. This outward demonstration of restored social trust mirrors the inward acceptance achieved in the relationship. The love interest's quiet encouragement in these social settings is crucial. They do not force the protagonist into the spotlight, but rather provide a steady, anchoring presence beside them. Their inspiration, perhaps drawn from historical figures known for community organizing or long-term charitable foundations, emphasizes collective endurance over individual flash. They celebrate the protagonist's tentative outreach, a sincere compliment offered to a guest, a moment of shared laughter that isn't self-conscious, as profoundly significant milestones, treating these small social victories with the same reverence they might treat a major professional success earlier in the film. This reframes external validation entirely. The worth comes from connection, not conquest. The film employs a final, understated symbolic gesture to cement this final piece. The protagonist incorporates an element of their former high-achieving aesthetic, a sharp, well-crafted piece of functional design, but places it in service of the shared life, rather than as a barrier. Perhaps it's a perfectly designed, sturdy bookshelf displaying the love interest's eclectic collection, or a minimalist desk now used for writing personal letters rather than corporate reports. This merging of their past capacity for excellence with their present value system signifies that their intelligence and drive have been repurposed, becoming tools for building a mutual life rather than weapons for self-defense. In its closing moments, the film avoids the typical grand pronouncement, instead offering a sense of earned continuation. Dump the past. Marry True Love concludes not with a farewell to pain, but with the quiet understanding that pain is simply a record of where one has been, not a map of where one must go. The lingering emotion is one of grounded hope, the realization that the hardest work was not conquering an external failure, but successfully negotiating peace with the most demanding and intricate territory of all, the self, finally shared without reservation. The ultimate signifier of the protagonist's integration and the narrative's full thematic maturation lies in their newfound, almost surprising, capacity for intellectual humility regarding the future. The earlier iterations of the protagonist demanded predictive certainty. Every decision had to be armored with contingency plans to ward off the chaos they anticipated. This stemmed from a core fear that any unforeseen variable would expose them as fundamentally inadequate. Now, however, their engagement with future planning with the love interest, be it coordinating schedules months out or discussing hypothetical scenarios, is characterized by a genuine comfort with the open-ended nature of life. The actor subtly conveys this by allowing a slight, knowing smile when the partner acknowledges an unpredictable element, replacing the tight-lipped tension of the first act with an open-mouthed acknowledgement of life's inherent ambiguity. The love interest, whose strength is derived from long-term, cyclical thinking, perhaps mirroring the patient cultivation seen in sustainable agriculture or foundational scientific research, serves as the constant, quiet reminder that growth is inherently messy. Their ability to articulate future uncertainties, not as threats, but as opportunities for shared adaptability, solidifies their role as the true emotional anchor. They don't just accept the protagonist's evolving self, they actively participate in constructing a relationship resilient enough to absorb inevitable future shocks. This is demonstrated when they deliberately undertake a venture whose success is years away, a tangible commitment to delayed gratification that mirrors the protagonist's own internal process. The visual motif shifts one final time, moving away from interiors altogether in the very last sequences, perhaps focusing on a long